Okay. Good morning, everyone. Now we're looking at Hebrews 8 as was read to us. And the theme of this chapter is that a superior covenant. We're talking about the new covenant as being superior to the old one. Last week and the week before, we sort of talked about the superior priesthood of Jesus. And the theme today is superior covenant. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask you this question. Are you in autosave mode? Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that you're saving yourself, certainly not that at all. But are you now, having been saved, thinking that's all you have to do? You can sit back and relax. The reason I thought of this was 2 weeks ago, 2 Thursdays ago, when I was preparing this message. I've been working on it all day here in the office and doing some other stuff, and finished about 3 o'clock, the basic, main thing, not all of it certainly, but most of it. And finished about 3, went and did some other jobs here till about, oh, hello, I didn't realise that. Where's Win? Oh, sorry, you can't see me. You want to move the couch around? Sorry. Anyway, been working on it all day, did some other jobs, but still here. And then Raylene rang up. Little George had fallen through the stairs on the back deck, fallen about 8-10 feet onto the gravel and hurt himself. Inside. George is the dog, little puppy. So I shut everything down in a hurry, went home, see how he was, and yeah, he was okay and he's good now. You wouldn't know anything had happened. Then the next day I went to work, opened up my computer, and it said recovered document. So all of my work the previous day I hadn't saved. But thankfully, because of autosave, or it's something else, but we'll call it autosave, the whole document was there. And it said, do you want to save it? Yes, please. So I'd done nothing. The computer had done it all by saving it. Sometimes I think we fall into the trap of sitting back and relaxing because Jesus has done it all. And we don't necessarily understand what our side of the covenant is. As we've been reading through Hebrews, there's been a lot of encouragement. We've been encouraged by telling us how good Jesus is, how great he is, how superior his sacrifice is, how complete his salvation is. That's been really encouraging, but also on the other side of that is a challenge not to take it for granted. Let's go through the passage and we'll get back to this idea of autosave at the end. As was read to us, the first verses open up with the main point. And don't you love it when the writer says that? The main point. Well, you don't have to try and work out what the main point is. He tells you. The main point is that we do have such a great high priest. And Andrew talked to us last week about that. He was a priest who meets our needs, is holy, blameless, pure, set apart, who's exalted above the heavens. And you see this in verse 27 and 28 of the previous chapter. He's not like the other priests. They offer sacrifices day after day. He offered it once. They are appointed by the law. He is appointed by the oath. Remember, we talked about how God swore that you are a priest forever. And then we're told that they are weak, but he is perfect forever. Because of the main point that we do have such a great high priest, there are 3 things that we need to get straight, that we need to understand. And that's what occupies the rest of the chapter. So that's what occupies the rest of the chapter. And those 3 things are the sanctuary in which he ministers, the nature of his sacrifice, and the covenant of which he's a mediator. Now, before we go on, in case there's any confusion, how do you pronounce covenant? Is it covenant or covenant? Doesn't matter? No. Doesn't matter. Okay, good. Thanks for that. I got in trouble once for calling it covenant. That's why I asked the question. It's not covenant, it's covenant. Okay. Why hasn't it got a U? Firstly, there is a superior sanctuary. And we're told in verse 5 that it's not an earthly Sorry, I don't know why I've written that there. So let me read. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by man. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. The sanctuary in which Jesus serves is the true sanctuary, not an earthly shadow of what is in heaven, but the real thing. The readers of this letter were being asked to leave their temple at Jerusalem with all its grandeur, all its magnificent architecture, its sacred courts, its holy place, its most holy place, its chanting, the pageantry, everything that went with it. The believers were being asked to leave that behind. And that would have been difficult. Maybe it's a little bit hard for us to picture it. I guess we've all seen models of the temple and the holy place, the most holy place, but they're just models. We don't see the real thing. And it's hard for us to get our minds around it. I think it is anyway. We tend to worship in places that are quite plain. Now, there's nothing wrong with this building in the fact that it is quite plain. We do it on purpose. We do it because we don't like being distracted by icons or images or grandeur. We want to focus on God. And so in our tradition, we build plain churches. And there's nothing wrong with that. But because of that, I think sometimes it might be a little bit hard for us to understand what it was like for these early readers to be asked to leave behind the temple. There are some magnificent churches around the world. The Salisbury Cathedral is one of them. Such a huge church. And inside, it's so grand. It really is a marvellous place to worship God. Something a little bit more gaudy, perhaps, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which still isn't finished after 100 and something years of being built. But it's a magnificent building. And the idea of the people that are building it is to bring people to a place where they see God. These buildings are meant to be a window through which people can see God and worship Him. And so if we worship in something like that or that, we might find it a bit hard to leave it behind and go and worship in somebody's mud brick house, which is probably what these early believers were being asked to do. It's important to realise that it's not just nostalgia that would stop them from wanting to leave the temple behind. That's a picture of the first car that I ever owned. Not that particular one. If I did, that would be good. But the first car I ever owned was an XT Falcon, which I bought second-hand in 1979 for $500 from the parish priest. $500. What a bargain. I sold it 2 years later for $500. Now, that one there, today, done up, looking nice, would be somewhere between 50 and 90,000, wouldn't it, Des? Yeah. It is too much money. Exactly the point. That is too much money for that car. But people pay that much money because they like old cars. That car is not very good. That car that I first drove didn't even have a heater, let alone air conditioning. Had none of the mod cons that we have in cars now. No power steering, no automatic, lots of things it didn't have, and that one wouldn't have them either because they try to keep them original. But people value it just because of nostalgia. There's something much more significant going on in people's reluctance to leave the temple. It's a deep spiritual significance. The temple contained the most holy place. Such was its sanctity that for 364 days a year, no one was allowed in there. And on that one day, only the great high priest. It was a place that was too holy for people, the normal people like you and me, to even go near. Even on that one day, when the high priest went in there, he would only go in for a few minutes, and for only a few minutes would glimpse the throne. He certainly would never have sat down on it. But the writer tells us that Christ has sat down, not at the right hand of some earthly throne, but the right hand of the actual throne of the majesty in heaven, and he invites us to join him. This was a stark contrast to anything that had been talked about before. It was a new sanctuary, a superior sanctuary, and it's superior because of the superior sacrifice. In verse 3 of what Loris read, we're told that it was necessary for him to offer something if he is to be considered a priest. Christ did that by offering himself once and once for all. Not like the human priests who offered sacrifices day after day for their sins and for the sins of others. Instead, if we read ahead into chapter 9, but when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, or sanctuary, that is not made with human hands, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For that reason, his ministry is superior to theirs, as superior as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one. And that's because it's built on better promises. I won't labour the point because we've dealt with it a fair bit and it comes up again in chapter 10. But we're told in verse 25 of chapter 7 that Christ is able to save completely because of his superior sacrifice. But let's go on to the covenant, which is the main theme of what we're talking about. A new covenant was necessary because the old one, we're told, was imperfect, powerless, and obsolete. Verse 13. Now, Loris, did you read that which is aging and obsolete will soon be gone? Aging? That's a worry for all of us. Because hopefully not too soon. It does say that too. And now what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. Well, we are all aging, but we're not obsolete yet. But the old covenant was obsolete. Now, Old Testament covenants were a common thing, and the pattern under which they were drawn up was common in the culture of their time. And to have a break from listening to me, we're going to listen to a little new YouTube video of what Old Testament covenants were like. And it says Old Testament covenants in 90 seconds, but it goes for about 2.5 minutes. So.
Covenant is any relationship that is entered into by two parties. If you ever had a contract, you have entered into a covenant. If you are married, then you are in a covenant. These are called parity treaties by scholars of the Old Testament. And there are a number of these in the Old Testament itself. You see, two people can come together, they can swear oaths that they will abide by certain stipulations, and then if one party fails, then certain ramifications will happen. That's not what we're talking about, though, when we're talking about the biblical covenant. What we mean when we talk about the covenant between God and his people is what is known as a suzerain vassal treaty. A suzerain vassal treaty is between two unequal parties. In most cases, it involves a sovereign or a king and his people. And these are very actually formal things. A king would come and he would first name himself, I am the king of this land and over this territory. The covenant would then lay out what the king had done for his people, all the wonderful exploits, and then the king, being the king, would give certain obligations for loyalty to him. You will abide by my laws, you will trust me, you will do this, you will do that. The sovereign would then lay out covenant blessings and covenant curses. If you keep this, you will get a certain amount of blessing. If you do not obey, then there will be curses. The importance of knowing this is that this is how God approaches his people. The most obvious place is in Exodus 20, which is the giving of the Ten Commandments. God comes and he follows this pattern in a way that is very familiar to those in the ancient world. He says, I am the Lord your God, and then he lays out what he has done for the people of Israel. He has brought them out of the land of Egypt, and he has for them the promised land. God then gives his stipulations, which in this case are the Ten Commandments. And then as you read through the rest of the 5 books of Moses, in particular in Deuteronomy, all of this is played out very, very much the way we have said. Now, God enters into covenants with his people or with individuals in a number of key areas. With Noah, with Abraham, in this case with God's people through Moses. And all of this is implied that God is going to bless his people, and he requires loyalty from them. However, as anyone who has read the Old Testament knows, Israel doesn't always get on with doing this very well. They fail as often as they succeed. And so, by Jeremiah's time, the time of the prophets, they begin to look forward to a time when God will bring a new covenant to bear, one based on the suffering servant who is to come. And so in the New Testament, when Christ says that in him, in his ministry, and in his life, death, and resurrection, that he is now our king and our lawgiver, that he is the fulfillment of God's covenant, and that therefore faith in him is what is needed, all of this is wrapped up in the biblical idea of the covenant.